Thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Dry. I'm your host tonight, and I'm one of the deputy editors of the politics section here at the Times. It's exciting. It's a new job for me. Sometimes when I tell people I meet that that's my job, what they say is, "That's a big job." And what I say back is, "I'm a big lady." Because it's important to let people know when something is not a compliment, I found. Oh, thank you. Obviously, we planned this event a little while ago when we thought, one of the main stories of the week would be the Democratic primary and this Iowa State Fair. You know how, events with a lot of pork products are often big news events. And certainly the events of the past few days and our approaches to covering them are weighing heavily on us and my colleagues, and that's a focus of ours upstairs at our desks. That's not what we're talking about tonight. It might be the subject of a later event, but I just want to let you know we're here, we're aware that serious things are happening in the world, and we're gonna have a little fun this evening while also keeping those things in mind. As I said, I'm the host. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself before we spend the evening together. I'm from Vermont originally, like Bernie. Yeah. I actually, Senator Sanders and I, at a certain point in our lives, marched together in several Memorial Day parades. I was playing the clarinet in a 6th grade marching band. Thank you. He was exactly the same. He's always been the same, perhaps better constitutionally suited to the clarinet than I was, but I don't know if that's ever been his instrument. Bernie and I are both Jews from Vermont, actually. There aren't a lot of us. When I was growing up, I actually thought Rachel was an unusual name. It's not the case. Actually, this new politics job, I said is no too, it's been good for me because I think I'm getting a step closer to being the most important Rachel in my mother's life. She's a very big MSNBC fan, and I haven't been in the #1 spot for a bit. Starting the new role, I don't know when you've started a new job, if you've wanted to sort of make resolutions and do things differently with something new, and I really wanted to tackle email differently, and I even got this book on how to email better for women. They have a book. And the main tip is efficiency. So instead of saying, "Wow, what an outside-the-box idea. That's not what I anticipated, but it's certainly something we could talk about," you're just supposed to say no. Because it means exactly the same thing, and one is much more efficient. But that's very scary. It's scary to assert yourself like that. So far, the only thing I'm doing is I'm just not hoping anyone's well. I'm just not doing it. You can wonder. We're talking tonight in our first segment, it's gonna be a delicious segment about food and the Iowa State Fair. And it's especially exciting to me that we're having a fair-related segment because that's why I started my journalism career in high school covering a fair in Vermont. And I learned a really important lesson. I remember I was covering the dedication of a new tractor pull arena. And I asked the volunteer who had led the construction of the arena, "Sir, can you tell me what exactly is gonna happen here?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, tractors are going to pull things." And I realized there actually are some dumb questions you can ask. Hopefully not this evening. We won't be asking any this evening. As I hope you're getting a feel, we're mixing serious discussion about the race and politics today with diversion, and mixing comedy and politics is my favorite thing. I do stand-up comedy also, and the first year I started performing, I was living in DC, and I competed in something called DC's Funniest Journalist competition. Just a thing that we had. And I didn't have a ton of material, so I didn't really calibrate the material to the setting, which was a room full of my colleagues and bosses. And I had a joke that was about Zumba class, and it just involved just a lot of silent choreography like this, which I just did in another room full of my colleagues and bosses. And one of the judges that night was Eleanor Holmes Norton, DC's non-voting representative to Congress. She had a vote that evening. she did not cast it for me. So really, I'm just so happy you're all here for this long game of redemption for me, because that's what we're doing when we're combining comedy and politics, really letting Delegate Norton know that we've come a long way. As I mentioned, we're going to start tonight with something delicious. We are so lucky to be joined by New York Times food columnist Melissa Clark, who has a new book coming out in March that you should pre-order, and I believe it's called Dining in French. And I'm very sorry, Melissa, but you should just look for all her books on Amazon and just see which one seems like it's coming out in March, or buy them all. She'll be in conversation with Jonathan Martin, one of our national political correspondents. And before they join you on stage, there's a little bit of something we're going to show you to whet your appetite. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, guys. How are y'all?
What'd you think of that? Good? Interesting? French fries, guacamole. Are you getting hungry? We like to do the food things at the beginning of the night, so that way you can get hungrier and hungrier for the rest of it when you're listening to everybody else. So let's get their appetites going.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
So should we talk deep fried Twinkie?
Let's talk all about Iowa and good food that's bad for you.
Oh. Have any of you been to the Iowa State Fair? I see.
There we go. Got one guy here in the front.
So
Don't be shy.
hands.
How many of you have been to a state fair, though? There we go. All right. So you kind of got the idea. So the Iowa State Fair is a political ritual and kind of a state tradition, because Iowa, of course, starts the nominating contest the year before. Is a huge deal in Des Moines. It's usually in August, so it's now. It actually is going on this weekend. And it lasts for, I think, a week or two. And it draws almost all of, or at times all of, the candidates running for the nomination in the following year. And some of you have seen the clips on TV over the years. There are a few rights to it. They take a turn at the pork producer's tent. They flip the pork chops.
They actually do the flipping?
They do the flipping themselves. That's part of the photo op. Wearing the smock from the pork producers, the big pig lobby, I call it. They taste the pork chop on a stick at times. They put the pork chop on a stick. And they get a corn dog, which can be harder to kind of navigate too. And they...
That's harder for a photo.
Yeah. It is, and we got one to prove it too.
You gotta be careful.
Exactly, and then yes, the overhyped but often discussed deep fried Twinkie. Now, not to spoil this for you guys, the deep fried Twinkie though, actually it's not all that great, because there are delicacies to be had at the Iowa State Fair. The deep fried Twinkie is not it. There is a great food that some of you who are from Indiana or Iowa may appreciate this: pork tenderloin sandwiches. Thank you. Fantastic, fantastic Iowa State Fair food. In fact, Iowa food generally. Pork tenderloin, sort of matted down, pounded down, deep fried, put on a hamburger bun, pickles, onion, mustard. It is hard to beat.
Okay,
my favorite Iowa food.
That sounds great, but it's not a deep fried Twinkie.
It's not.
Have you had a deep fried Twinkie?
I have. I didn't write home about it.
You didn't write? Okay. So let me tell you about the deep fried Twinkie story. So I would like to say that one of the proudest moments in my life as a journalist is I broke the deep fried Twinkie story. Without my reporting, there may not be deep fried Twinkies. You might have to make do with a deep fried Oreo when you go to the state fair. So imagine this, 2002. There's a little chip shop, a fish and chip shop in Brooklyn called The Chip Shop, and it's run by a Scottish guy. And when you are a fish and chips store owner, and he grew up, he was a teenager, he fried fish and chips his whole life, basically. He said, what do? You just get a bunch of stuff, you're bored, you're sitting there at the end of the night, and you just throw it in the fryer and see what tastes good.
I love it.
So, when you're in Scotland, you do it with Mars bars. You do it with,
haggis.
Haggis. You do it with haggis, exactly.
You got haggis fans here, I see tonight.
Yes,
Good.
you do it with haggis, and it's delicious. I personally have loved that. But when you're in Brooklyn, what do? You go to the bodega, and Twinkies are 50 cents for like 3 packets, and you throw them in the fryer. So there I am, a food reporter, a newbie food reporter, and I go to the chip shop and I see this thing on the menu, and I personally think it's absolutely delicious because that fake cream, the white stuff in the middle, it melts. And it impregnates the Twinkie with vanilla, artificial vanilla. The Twinkie gets soft, the crunchiness on the outside. Now, he served it. Do we have a pic?
We do.
It's hard to see. This is the article.
I didn't want to step on her story, but this is the story itself. The Twinkie world exclusive. Right here in print.
And what happened is after I published the story, the deep fried Twinkie became a thing. And the guy, Christopher was his name, Christopher Sell, he became a little mini celebrity. And he would go around, he would do the radio and TV circuit publicizing this deep fried Twinkie. That was his innovation. So there you go. I have added a little bit to Iowa State Fair culture with this by breaking this story.
It's worth trying. It's worth trying. Now, the other thing that obviously big in Iowa, which won't come as a surprise to you, it's one of their most popular crops, of course, is corn. And the corn stalks are super high this time of year during the middle of summer. And so there's lots of corn to be had at the Iowa State Fair. This is important for Cory Booker, who's our first major vegan candidate for president. We've got some vegans here, okay? I won't hold it against you. So Cory will have a hard time at the State Fair because it's so pork-centric being in Iowa. But he can find his way to the corn on the cob, which, yes, does come on a stick in Iowa. Now, here is the corn dog, which is also popular at the
Actually, you know what I saw on the list? So if you go on the Iowa State Fair website, it tells you every single food on a stick that you can buy. There are like 67 foods on sticks.
It's gotten excessive.
Yeah, they put peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on a stick.
Right.
Like, why would you do that? But they also do have a vegan corn dog. So yeah, that's a brand new food.
He can try that.
He could have that. So.
I've had a vegan meal with Cory Booker, by the way.
Have you? And?
Yeah, but he is not a reluctant vegan. He's an enthusiastic vegan.
Anybody who enjoys their food.
Like he wants to spread the gospel of veganism.
Oh, really?
Oh my goodness, yeah. He shares it. He wants you to try it. No, he's super into it. He's super into it.
All right, well,
Absolutely.
so maybe you'd have to share a fake corn dog with him, fake meat corn
dog. Now, this looks to the naked eye like a burger. Not a burger. That is a pork burger, not a beef burger. And you can tell that because of the big pig smock there, the pork producer shirt they have on. This is one of the rituals. They have the photo op where the candidates flip the pork on the grill.
So now what is Cory Booker going to do? Is he going to not flip the... This is tricky.
Well, I think no. Cory will I think flip the pork. I mean, he wouldn't eat it, but I think he would flip it.
But he'll flip it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That on the left is a Iowa pork provider. The guy on the right, I'm not sure who that is. Can't quite make it out. No. So President Trump avoided a lot of the kind of rituals of campaigning in 2015 and 2016. You know, there's sort of this mythology that has taken up that, you know, if you go to Iowa or New Hampshire, you have to go to every living room in the state. You have to personally court the voters and ask for their support 3 times, you know, before they even consider you. And the truth is that he actually didn't do a lot of that. He flew back almost every night to New York on his own plane, rarely stayed overnight, rarely went to any kind of living rooms, let alone do any kind of coffee clashes. But he did do the Iowa State Fair. He brought his helicopter in there, and he gave kids helicopter rides.
Oh my God.
On his helicopter.
I think that beats sitting in someone's living room, though.
Well, to the kids, sure, certainly.
Yeah.
And he, came over with those French cuffs on. Probably the only candidate to ever eat pork chop on a stick with French cuffs, I think it's safe to say, in the history of the Iowa State Fair. And he tried Iowa's famous product there. And unclear if he actually finished it. This is one of the great moments, though, when you cover politics. The candidates always do this. They'll take like the first bite, maybe 2 bites. Oh, it's so great. Oh, this is fantastic. You know, like not in their head like that. Like it's just like the best they've ever eaten in their lives. And then like you watch them and they do like one of these deals where they put the hand down like this and they look for the staffer to come over and the staffer kind of edges over and
somebody has to take
out
their
of your
pork
way,
chop
sir, ma'am. You know, get that for you right there. And well, where'd it go? It's already gone. Now, if I was a kid, I would just hammer the whole thing, you know. But that's why I'm not a candidate. All right, Hillary Clinton. We got some Hillary Clinton fans here. All right.
She's got her lemonade.
This is the Iowa State Fair. She's got her pork chop on a stick. And to her credit, has taken more than 1 bite. You can tell. So that's good. Lemonade also on offer there at the state fair. That's probably 2015, I would guess, when she was there.
So let me ask
yeah,
you,
please.
Jonathan. So what is it about the food? I mean, they have to eat the pork because
Yeah.
they're with the pork producers and
Yes.
it's Iowa. You have to eat the
It's Iowa,
corn.
right.
What are the other things that are the must-try things? Like, is there a certain? What does it say about the candidates if they choose, say, the Twinkie over the deep-fried Oreo or the salad on a stick versus the fruit kebab on a stick? Are they sending a message?
I think unless you've got a dietary reason like Cory Booker, I think you're pretty much expected to have a pork chop on a stick or some kind of pork product, right?
Right.
The corn dog's a little bit more daring. Not everybody does that. But the pork deal, though, is kind of central to the whole ritual of
So because that's just showing that you're. It's like a solid American value, right? A pork chop on a stick.
It's Iowa. This is like, it's like part of their culture. It's certainly a huge driver in their economy. And it's the candidate's way of showing that, just like, what's the old line about every American candidate for president wants you to think that they were born in a log cabin that he or she built.
Right. Don't know how that works, but
That's a good line, right? Think about it for a minute. They all want the voters to think that they're just plain folks, just down-home people who, on a Saturday, otherwise would be happy to be at a state fair, eat the pork chop on a stick. It's part of their life.
And then let me take this one step further. So we have, Iowa's obviously the beginning. It's like this is the mad rush, this is the caucus, but then you have New Hampshire, right? And when you go to New Hampshire, it's a whole other way. I mean, what are the things you have to eat in New Hampshire?
Dunkin' Donuts.
So you go to New Hampshire, you have to eat the Dunkin'. And do you eat the Dunkin'? No. Do you eat and then do you have to eat what the candidates eat in order to fully cover them?
It's less the donuts than the coffee at Dunkin', right? I mean, we say Dunkin' Donuts, but actually it's just Dunkin', right?
Yeah, it's
coffee.
Dunkin'. All right, it's Dunkin'.
It's the coffee. John McCain was famous for putting down like incredible amounts of coffee during the course of a day. And he loved New Hampshire for obvious reasons. He won there in 2000, and that kind of put him on the map nationally. And so he always loved New Hampshire. And he would go up there on his bus, the Straight Talk Express, and he would just guzzle coffee all day. And Dunkin' has those what are those things called? The jar, not jars, but the
the little boxes
crates.
with the boxes with the coffee and the little spout.
And they put those on the bus, and he would just go through it.
But no donuts?
Donuts, sure, but it was more of a coffee thing. I think like the New Hampshire cuisine is more like New England. So lobster rolls in the summer right now, for example, are very popular. Ice cream during the summer is very popular. But it's not quite like Iowa where, pork and corn are so central to the economy there. So it's more of an economic thing and cultural thing.
Now, for you personally, though, do you feel like you need to kind of eat what they're eating? Like,
Yes.
is that you do? You feel
That's
like
part of the fun. That's part of the fun.
so like
I'm getting paid for this. I'm going to eat the food absolutely.
so you're but you're going to eat the same things that the candidates kind of get in there, like.
I feel like I'm not doing my job as a Times political reporter. I'm not serving you, the readers, and the subscribers. God love all of you, as Joe Biden would say. If I am not eating the food that both the candidates and people in these states are eating, so that I can then relate what's happening on the ground.
Right.
It's part of my job. I mean, dare like not to do it.
I completely agree
Tell my
with
wife
you.
the same thing, by the way. I have to do it.
Got to do it.
I come back 10 pounds heavier. All right, let's go to. God love, what is that? I don't even know what that
I think
is.
that's the bologna on a stick.
Deep fried bologna, folks. What a country, huh? Next. Now,
I'm guessing corn fritter.
oh,
I'm going with
is
corn
it corn fritter?
I'm guessing corn
Is that
fritter.
what it is? Yeah.
It's hard. We were looking at these and they were really small. So now seeing it big, I'm going to go with corn fritter.
So I cover politics full time, but I have dabbled in some other sections. And one of the most fun stories that I did was in the build up to the 2016 Iowa caucuses, I did a story for our food section, which I think is the best part of the Wednesday paper. Don't you all agree, by the way? Every Wednesday, thank you. Food section. Who doesn't love it? All about Iowa restaurants, because there's this misnomer held by perhaps some folks on the East Coast that you're in Iowa, there's nowhere to eat, the food is not any good. That's just not the case. There is a fantastic food scene there. Those of you who are from Wisconsin know this, but the sort of supper club culture, there's lots of those in Iowa that are really good.
What's this? So tell us about a supper club.
So it's basically like a restaurant that tends to serve like dinner only.
Mm-hmm.
They are known for their steaks and their prime rib. They oftentimes bring out those push carts at the start of the meal, and they bring you olives and
Martinis?
yeah, like Manhattans and
sounds
steaks, and it's a really sort of
Potatoes?
neat upper Midwest tradition. Baked potatoes, yeah. Cheese curds, if you can get them. And there's this great food in Des Moines, too, because Des Moines got some really charming neighborhoods. By the way, the best neighborhood in Des Moines, the East Village. It's literally called the East Village.
Really?
Yes, it's, no hyperbole. It's
Well,
called
you
the
know.
East Village. And there's great places to eat there. So I did this whole story about the places to eat in Iowa, and I was proud of it. And it's one of those stories where like you spend so much of your time covering politics, and you write a story about like, where to eat in Iowa. For a month afterwards, every colleague or source came up to me and said, "Hey, that was a great story." Oh, on the Cruz campaign or Trump or Hillary? No, the food in Iowa was a great story. I'm like, what?
That is the thing about writing about food. It's like that's the thing.
People read it.
People,
right?
and they want to talk about it because everybody eats. All right, what else do we have?
Let's go.
I wanted, yeah, this is the
Yes.
one I wanted to get to, those giant pumpkins. Don't you love going to the, is it the 4-H or the Future Farmers of America hut, you know, where you see the crazy vegetables, the flower is this big.
It's more of a
How many
fall thing, though, right?
How many pies would that make? How many
my
How many do you
can you
think?
imagine?
Can you take a guess? I'm guessing that would make, I bet you could get 50 pies out of that. That's my guess.
I'd say easily.
That little girl's so proud.
Now, here we go. You can't make it up, folks. The aforementioned 2015 Iowa State Fair, then civilian Donald J. Trump with his eponymous helicopter, the Trump copter, flying high above the Des Moines Fair, the Iowa State Fairgrounds, giving kids some tours on that chopper. And the kids loved it, and it got lots of attention that day and the days after. And folks, this is the butter cow. Now,
In case
most
you
of
had
you
any
have
doubt.
heard of the deep fried Twinkie, and some of you also probably heard of the butter cow. That is a cow entirely made of, yes, butter. Now, you have to admire the art. I mean, the tail, the udder, I mean, it's just incredible, right? Those teats, it's a thing of beauty, you know?
So what happens to it after?
I have to confess, when I went to the Iowa State Fair for the
Yeah.
first time, I was so excited for the butter cow. There was a line for it to get. I mean, you would think you were at the Louvre and like
Yeah.
going to see Mona Lisa, and it was like the butter cow line was like, yeah, I have the 12:45 appointment for the butter cow, and you can't make this shit up, and it was incredible. And I got in there. I gotta say, kind of cool, but didn't really. Yeah, I mean,
Not as good in person?
yeah, it was impressive, but you know, I think part of the problem is there's so much stuff in the room made of butter.
Yeah.
That like just the cow itself is like one more thing of butter in the
Right,
room.
well, I see a butter
You
car.
can see the butter
I see a butter,
wagon
yeah,
next
butter
to it.
wagon,
Yeah,
all right.
exactly.
and we don't know what happens to the butter cow after?
It goes to the great butter cow in the sky. No, I'm.
Okay, that's some reporting that I might have to do next
We
year.
gotta figure that out. And is that? Yeah.
And that is us.
Is that us?
That is
Thank you so
us.
much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Yeah. And by the way, the Iowa State Fair going on this weekend, so if you don't have plans for the weekend, Des Moines, there's nonstop flights. Enjoy. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melissa Clark and Jonathan Martin.
Thanks, guys.
Jonathan Martin moonlighting for the Iowa Tourism Bureau there, a little freelance ad. I hope that was delightful and seemed delicious, although I did realize we ended with the butter cow visual, which, you know, I guess your mileage may vary on how appetizing that is to think about. We're going to keep going. I just wanted to share a number with you that I just Googled briefly on my phone, so I'm not sure that it's correct, but 455. That's the number of days, according to the people who have the best search engine optimization. That's the number of days until the 2020 election, which seems like a marathon. I don't know. I've never run or contemplated running a marathon. But our next two guests certainly have. We're very, very lucky to be joined this evening by Lindsay Krause, a writer and editor in the opinion section, who also happens to be a sub-elite marathon runner, and 2016 Olympian Alexi Pappas, who are going to talk with us and speak about how the candidates might approach this marathon election season. Before we bring them to stage, there's a little bit more we wanted you to hear from the candidate video project. You'll hear about how much stress they're going to endure, and then here is what they might do to blow off some of that stress. and then you'll be joined by Lindsay and Alexi after. Thank you so much.
So hi everyone, I'm Lindsay. I'm an editor and a writer in the opinion department. I also run a lot of races. This is Lexi Pappas, and she also runs a lot of races, and she wins them.
Sometimes. Running is one of those sports where you rarely actually win, and that doesn't always indicate failure, even when you don't win.
Even in a presidential race, potentially. But I can also say that from our running on the West Side Highway this morning that you're very, very fast.
We ran 10 miles, and we were side by side every step, so I think that says a lot about both of us.
Yeah, but so anyway, so we're here to talk about what I think are pretty interesting parallels between the political race, the 2020 race, and distance running, which we both do, and in particular cross-country racing. And the really interesting thing about cross-country and distance running is that it seems like an individual sport, but it's actually really a team sport. And I know in your career, you've really experienced that. I mean, it sounds like just from our run this morning, you started at Dartmouth and you weren't even necessarily varsity all the time. Like, just seems like hitting just even scoring for the team was a big aspiration for you. And then it sounds like also the really catalytic experience for you was finding a team. And actually, when you got to the University of Oregon, that was what really made the difference for you, and you became one of the best runners in the country. And so I actually thought that there was something about that team analogy in this political race that applies to your career. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, to take it back like a half step before college, in high school, I think I very much saw running as like a very 100% individual sport, which on paper it is very individual. You cross the line alone, it is an individual sport. But it wasn't until college and until this moment that you talked about that I found that at its worst, almost, it's an individual sport, and at its best, it's a team sport. And what really unfolded was there was a girl named Jordan who I was to be teammates with during this time called the fifth year, which is like a time that sometimes you have 4 years of college, sometimes you get a fifth year. And I graduated from my undergrad experience at Dartmouth, and I went on to Oregon to do this one season, basically. It was like a half year. And there was a girl there named Jordan who was the best on the team and one of the best in the country. And I was there to kind of support. As a fifth year, you really just want to contribute to the team. And we had this first race. And I remember that I beat her in that race. And it was a really, it was a challenging moment for us because she wasn't used to not winning. And I wasn't even necessarily comfortable being in that position. And after that, it could have gone one of two ways. We could have continued to be individuals in an individual sport and be training partners and maybe be at odds every practice and maybe make each other better, but maybe not. Or we could figure out how to be teammates. And I remember we had this conversation about teammateship and about like, can running be a team sport, and like, can we be better together? Because we had these goals to win the NCAA, the national title, and we wanted it. And so she was like, well, what do we mean? Like, what do we mean be a team? And every day at practice, she wanted it. She wanted to have a teammate, and you could tell we both wanted it. And we talked about how we could be honest with each other. And we started to kind of just share with each other what our experience was during a workout. So you can totally hide your pain, or you can share it. And to share some of the experiences we were having in the workout was actually like a really generous thing that we could do for each other, so that, let's say I was side by side with her, like you and I were this morning, and I was experiencing a rough patch. A rough patch is like, in a race, in a workout, you experience, a feeling where you might want to stop. And you don't have to stop. Like the mind might indicate that before you really have to stop. So it's a rough patch. And to share that with her and to be like, this is a rough patch, I'm feeling not great, was an opportunity for her to say, you know, we could do this. And for me to learn how to focus my breath, to focus on her breath rather than my own. So when I was experiencing rough patches, this is just a very like, actually how it happened. This is very like nitty gritty here, but I would pretend like she was doing the breathing for us, and like vice versa. When I was feeling good, I was in a good moment in a workout, we had different strengths, she could hopefully rely on me to like carry us through the next minute until her rough patch passed. And it passes. And I think that's like that was like in the meat of like a workout. And then in the course of a season, the course of a race, there were tactics we could use to help each other so that our team could collectively win. Like, of course, in the last chunk of a race, may the woman who has it that day cross that finish line first. And often Jordan beat me, and our team was successful, and I became a better athlete for it. And so in that way, we were so much better together than we were apart. And we won that NCAA title, and it was pretty special. And cross country is special in that way, where the individuals matter, but the team collectively means the most.
Yeah, like you can do your best, but ultimately you're just trying to get your team to win. And often that means that can happen either with you winning the race, but also just, doing your best overall, which I think does parallel this political race a little bit. It also reminds me a lot of kind of what might be happening. I mean, who can say? Neither of us are political reporters, but if I speculate, I think it reminds me of what the female candidates might be doing in this race, where presumably they've grown up their whole lives, like just dying for the first female president to be there. Of course, they all want it. Like they're all so close, closer than they probably ever thought they would be in a lot of cases. But they want it to be themselves. But they also just want someone to win. And so presumably, I'm just wondering, like, if you think that might be an analogy that applies to what you were doing at Oregon with Jordan, who, by the way, became one of the second best marathon runner in the country ever. Is that right?
She's certainly the fastest going into the 2020 trials.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
It's amazing. So yeah, I think there's certainly that element of like, let's each have integrity with I'm speaking as an athlete, let's have integrity with our training, let's have integrity with our races. But there is like, if you're talking about like female as a sort of team, then I suppose that makes sense, that we want this team to do well, and this team can do better if we learn to look at it a little differently, even though on paper it all looks the same. It's just, I think it's more of a mindset than anything else.
I mean, it also reminds me of what you were talking about this morning when we were running about what it was like at the actual Olympics, where you're not racing against anyone even, in your heat necessarily, in your race. No, the pack that you find yourself in, they're not even Americans or whatever on your team with your own country. And so, but you still need to work with everyone in order to be better and in order to achieve your goal. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about, connect that to the race somehow and what kind of tactics you use in that context.
Yeah, the Olympics was so crazy because you almost like this audience here, you like almost can't see anybody around you, the thousands of people, except for the women that are like right there on the track with you. And again, on paper, like you want to run out of your mind, you want to rip each other's heads off, but in practice, it's really important to work together for a good chunk of a long distance race. So I ran the 10,000, which is the longest event on the track. It's 25 laps, 6.2 miles, and the marathon is, I think, the closest equivalent in that sense of like, it's a long race. And so these team tactics start to apply with women who like, you don't even speak the same language and you don't even really communicate about what the team tactic is. It sort of happens naturally, and it's in your best interest in a race to not run the entire thing like entirely alone. And so what happened in the Olympics was I was sort of given, it was a world record breaking race, And I did not break the world record, but I broke my personal record, and that was important.
We can clap for that.
But how it happened was really, like, I really wasn't alone, because there was a group of women who, for a chunk of the race, coach said, like, you're to stay within this rough pace range that's reasonable for you for 20 out of the 25 laps. And within that, you stay on the rail, because why would you run more than the rail is like the inside of the closest you can to run the tangent of the track. And you get in a line with women, and you start to feel like, just like that Jordan relationship, that like their breath is yours, their rhythm is yours, and you're not determining pace. You're just like, you're in the zone, and you might trade off leads. And what's interesting is some of these collaborations, you might have a word or two to exchange. It might be an eye contact thing of like your turn to like lead for a lap or two. And there might be no words at all. It's just understood that this is the best way for us to get to our goal. And then in the last 5 laps, it was sort of a free-for-all. And I think that the most interesting part about it is that our race plan was not everybody's race plan. And you find the women that are fitting in with your goals. And the minute that they don't fit in with your goals, so you have to be very like both meditative and turned off, and also very on, because the minute that a woman drops ahead of you a lap pace that's like too slow for what you want to do or for your integrity of your race, you've got to drop them. You've got to move on and go around them. And that takes like a constant attention to like what's going on. And so you're only working together as long as it's useful to your goal, and you hope that it's synergistic for longer and with more people. It's not always, but in my case, I think we had a nice pack, you know, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It actually reminds me a little bit of when I was watching the debates, I think it was last week at this point, but watching Sanders and Liz Warren just kind of almost packed together. I mean, you can almost assume that they didn't come up with that in advance, but somehow in reinforcing each other, I think at one point Sanders said what Liz said, and what she said was right, and at one point she reinforced what he said. And together they had almost like viral moments that kind of catapulted them ahead of, I think the analysis was that they really dominated together that debate. It reminds me a lot of what you're saying there. And I think that those kind of unspoken alliances can actually be really powerful. And so it's probably a lesson to candidates and also to all of us. I was sort of curious about, to that point, like when we watch all of these candidates conduct their campaign, like when you're racing, how do you decide when to actually take the lead versus when to kind of like sit in the pack, sit in the race? Like how do you want to be in front the whole time, like a candidate, or like for example Biden in this case, or do you want to kind of be sitting back and just waiting to make your move? Like how do you know when to take that risk? You can't always control, but what do you do when that happens?
Yeah, I think in running, again, I'll speak from that experience in running. You prepare as best you can before the race, and that's any number of things, from like eating the proper things to discussing race strategy with your coach. And when you get in the race, I think it's important to go in there with as composed a strategy that you've crafted with your coach or with your team, whoever that core brain trust is, and execute what you're told. I mean, running is hard enough that putting in the willpower to making decisions during a race is simply going to drain something that like you really need, right? You really need that in the last lap. And so I think in terms of making a move or something unexpected, usually a coach gives me a parameter for a certain period of time, and I follow it. And what it meant in the Olympics was really interesting because, as I mentioned, it was a world record-breaking race, and so the girl in front, I knew ahead of time that I would likely, as did 99% of the race, get lapped. And what it meant, I mean, that is for an Olympian, that doesn't happen often. And so what it meant in the race was, so my coach gave me a certain pace range for the first 20 laps, as I mentioned. And in the first lap, I was within the pace range, and that put me in last. And that didn't feel like where I was meant to be, where I was hoping to finish, but it was where I was in the beginning because I followed this plan. And sure enough, slowly, girls came back to me. It looks like, you know, if I'm like a fixture, it looks like this whole thing kind of came back to me. And really, I didn't change much of what I was doing for the first 20 laps. It's just that long distance running is truly a race of attrition.
Yeah.
And when you talk about that move, I was allowed to make my move with 5 laps to go and knew that like I could do that. In a different race, the goal might be different and the coach might tell me like the move is, let's try it here, let's try something here, let's do it at the very beginning and you will lead this race. But I think coming back to your question, it's just about going in with a plan and the confidence to execute with composure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just like a campaign in that way. What's the best advice you've ever gotten when it comes to racing? Because I feel like it could apply probably to the 2020 race.
Yes, the best advice I've ever gotten in my whole life, I'm going to impart on you now, which is, I'm serious. So my Olympic coach was named Ian Dobson, and he was an Olympian himself, and I had a really rough workout a couple weeks before we were going to go to this altitude camp and then go to Rio, and I was not thrilled that I did not feel great and did not hit the times that I was hoping to hit. And he was like, just like give 100% of what you've got today. Anyway, we finished the workout and I was like not feeling great. And he was like, it's okay. Like, Lex, this is great. This is the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds, he so wisely told me about, is that when you are chasing a dream or doing anything that's challenging, that's hard, you are meant to feel good a third of the time, okay a third of the time, and kind of crappy a third of the time. And it goes a step further to say that if you feel too good too much of the time, you're probably not pushing yourself enough, right? In athletics, in a creative endeavor, in whatever. Like if you feel good all the time, like maybe it's not like such a hard thing you're doing, or maybe you could push a little harder. If you feel crappy like way too much of the time, you might be fatiguing in a physical way, or it's too much. There's something off about that ratio. And learning about that ratio was such a gift, because then you start to relish in the days where you feel sort of crappy, because you're like, oh my gosh, I must be like chasing a dream and like right on that path, and it's such a privilege then to wake up and feel like good, okay, or crappy, and to know. I think the coolest thing is that like you're committed to a goal. So like it could be a presidential race goal or an Olympic race goal, and you know that within that window, you're just gonna feel like a wave of things. And it's such a gift to not check out of the fundamental goal just because you feel crappy one day. And it's the biggest problem that I think Olympic hopefuls have, is that when they feel crappy, they question the fundamental goal instead of seeing it as a part of the whole journey and seeing it as just perfect, just right,
Well, I think in that way, there's a metaphor for both the presidential candidates for whom becoming president is the equivalent of your going to the Olympics, I would imagine. But it's also a metaphor for all of us in terms of the 2020 is a long run, long race, and it's not going to feel good the whole time. But hopefully, in the end, it's the path that we want. But anyway, I know we have to wrap, even though I could talk about this all day long, as I'm sure you could too. But just one last thing. I know you have a huge following among particularly teenage girls. I mean, on the run this morning, she was swamped by a million of them. It was really adorable. And they call themselves Bravies, which I know is the name of the book that you have coming out. And so you send words of encouragement to them that are kind of in the line of poetry, because I know you're a poet as well. And one of them is, training is like building a sandcastle. Every grain of sand is important, even if you can't see them all. And so I just want to know, I was wondering if you could just connect that again for us, because there are so many parallels, I think, between trying to do something great and what the candidates are trying to do in terms of becoming president and ideally, doing what they think is great for this country, probably something in service that they've always wanted to do their whole life. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the idea is that running, I guess chasing that dream is like really unglamorous in most of its moments. And it's just really important that we buy into the idea that we have to show up every day. Like we show up, we just show up and we show up and we show up and we show up. Even if some of those grains of sand are a day off, like a lot of athletes have trouble taking a day off, but that's just as important as the grain of sand, which is your pinnacle workout. And so I think the sandcastle metaphor can mean a lot of things depending on what your need is, but the point is that every element that goes in, even the mental side of sport or of whatever you're doing, is just as important as the food you're putting in your body, the sleep. And so I think it's a really wonderful way of saying that I'm just gonna try my best, and every bit of trying my best counts. And it won't all be seen, but the sandcastle at the end will be momentous, and it will be the product of all of these grains of sand.
And that's exactly what we're hoping will happen next year. So everyone, thank you. Lexi Pappas, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi again. Thank you for sticking with us. We took a little detour. We're getting directly into the race now. Small housekeeping things. I think some of you, or most of you, got cards on your way in. If there are questions you would like to pose to our distinguished panel, if you've written them, raise them up, and someone will come. An usher will come down the aisle and pick those up from you, and we'll put those to these guests at the end of our conversation. If you need another minute to do it, take a minute to do that. So I want to reintroduce and introduce some of my brilliant new colleagues. I'll start with the people you haven't already met this evening. So Stead Herndon, Katie, okay, yeah, that's it, that's her. Katie Gluck. And when he's not sampling the cuisines of all the early voting states, Jonathan Martin also covers national politics.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk for a bit about what it's like out there already. I think for a lot of people it feels very early, but these people have been doing quite a bit of work already, and they've traveled quite a bit, and wanted to try and give you a sense of what it's like, what you might not see on TV, or, I mean, you read a lot of in their coverage, it brings it to life. But that's the conversation we're going to have now for a bit, and then we'll get to your questions at the end. So Katie made it here, within 2 hours off the plane?
Something like that.
Yes, she just came back from a swing in Vegas and then in California. And you've been on the road quite a bit, covering a lot of events. There are a lot of people to cover. She mostly covers Joe Biden. And what I'm always curious about is we always write, they're at a house party, they're at this event at this diner in these states. Who is going to these events? Who is putting in their calendar, the party I want to go to is in Indianola with Kamala Harris, or whatever kind of party they might want to be. If you give us a picture of the sort of people who are showing up and interacting with the candidates.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, and great to be here with all of you. Thank you all for coming. So the voters who are showing up at these events at this early stage are extremely, extremely engaged. I was in Iowa a couple of weeks ago talking, with Jonathan, talking with one voter at a Democratic picnic about his thoughts on Joe Biden, and he cited a biography from a former defense secretary who had offered his own assessment of Joe Biden, and that is the level of sort of informed voter that we're talking about here.
Hello, a former defense secretary also said to me. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
It's not out of the question that someone at a Times event audience might present us with a similar
Right.
level of expertise.
Yeah, half this crowd is saying, I read the Bob Gates book too. I don't know what you're talking. Is that weird?
And do they collect mementos or take pictures, or how are they sort of documenting their journey here as, very reliable representatives of early state voters?
Well, you will talk to a lot of voters who, in addition to being extremely well informed, are also not looking to commit. Especially in Iowa, especially in New Hampshire, there is very much an expectation that they meet a lot of these candidates, sometimes meet them multiple times, have personal conversations with them, sometimes have conversations about their particular pet policy issue. And you'll meet lots of voters who have stories going back decades about this meeting with Bill Clinton or that meeting with Bob Dole, and still have the bumper stickers and the campaign buttons. Wow. So very high information voters with some pretty high standards.
Ested, you have spent time covering intensively both Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, and you've heard them speak quite a bit about their voters. When you hear the same joke or same line like 7 times in 72 hours, what do you do? Like, how do you fake a laugh? Or like, what's
Drink
the
heavily.
professional response
Alcohol.
to
Silent.
the
Yeah. Drinking. I mean, I think that.
What was the professional response to?
No, I mean, that is just a part of it. I mean, I think part of our job is to kind of track those differences. Sometimes it's very interesting to see how they tailor their stump speech to different audiences, but mostly you get the same tenets, right? Like, I have heard Elizabeth Warren talk about that mother's dress that leads her to that moment, right? Like, I have heard Kamala Harris, talk about the 3 a.m. phone call where you need, wondering what let's speak truth. Those are the things that you hear over and over. I think that we are in a privileged position to be in, and I think for as much as I sometimes internally roll my eyes at that, it is important to realize that the people coming to that are only usually hearing that for the first time, and tracking those kind of emotions that they bring to it, and their responses can sometimes be pretty illuminating. I mean, I think I have heard Elizabeth Warren talk about black home ownership rates on her stump speech maybe 20 times. But it always strikes me how much white folks in Iowa respond to that way more emotionally than when she's talking to blacker audiences who are kind of intuitively connected with that, right? Like, there's a sense of learning that happens at one that doesn't happen at the other. So I try as much as possible to remain fresh on these things, but certainly the jokes, and politicians aren't generally funny people, period. The jokes get exhausting.
Well, as you said, one response is to drink.
Yeah.
So Katie and Jonathan, you recently published a very interesting, and I would imagine sensitive to report story. This was ahead of the debate. You had a great look at Joe Biden, who's currently the front runner in the polls and is in his 70s. And the story was about, I think you spoke to, more than 50 people, about, how old is too old to run for president and be the president. And I wonder, Jonathan, if you could speak to the sensitivity of asking someone how old is too old. Yeah. How do you gauge that person's age before you approach them? Do you make sure they're younger than Joe Biden before you ask that question?
I think it's safe to say that we talked to people who were older, about the same age, and certainly younger than Joe Biden for this story. It was across the actuarial tables, and we got some pretty candid responses, but we also got some euphemistic responses.
Yeah, what were some of the euphemisms?
That was one of the best or most sort of revealing elements of this story is, look, a lot of people don't want to come out and say that they think somebody's too old to be president. So they oftentimes turn to references like new blood, or he had a good run, or somebody else's turn.
Fresh face. New generation.
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of JFK sort of homage and the new generation thing. You sort of hear that a lot. So you kind of had to decipher some of it. I had one memorable experience. I had a lady in South Carolina who saw him speak, and he had this memorable stumble over a few stats, and she said, I don't want to be ageist, but he couldn't get it together there, and she tried to catch herself, but she let it fly, and so it was a delicate topic, but look, I think fair game, and we didn't hear any kind of pushback at all from the Biden campaign.
Right, and in fact, he says all the time that it's totally fair game. What's really interesting is, he was first elected to the Senate at age 29 and spent so much of his career being the person who was the new generation.
Young guy.
Exactly, and he was the person, sort of pushing for that fresh face. And so all the time on the campaign trail, he says it's a totally fair question, but watch me, is sort of how he approaches it.
He served with World War I veterans in the Senate.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea, folks who were born in the 19th century. It's astonishing. I was with Biden July 4th in Iowa, a small town called Independence, very fitting for July 4th. And he zigzagged through the town, and he was jogging, doing his running Joe routine. And
How was his form? I think Alexei would have approved of
Was
his
that-
form.
it was good form.
What third
Yeah,
was
it
he
good
in?
form.
He was in the front. Yeah, it was
He,
I mean, probably better than
and
my form.
it was kind of a blue collar part of the state, and so there were some folks there who were having some beverages, sort of late morning July 4th beverages.
Sure,
and,
late morning beverages.
Why not? July 4th, hell, it's a holiday. So there were a couple people who were yelling like, what?
Sleepy Joe.
Sleepy Joe. I was going to say Lazy Joe. Sleepy Joe, which is the new Trump name for Biden, Sleepy Joe. And Biden loves telling the story now. He told someone he razzed him and said, "Oh, I'm Sleepy Joe. Well, come with me and run the parade." The guy was like, "No, I'm good. I'm good." And so Biden loves
Yes.
telling. But there was one lady that I saw though who was impressed. But this does show just how deeply the Trump names penetrate. She said, "Wow, they can't call you Sleepy Joe anymore."
Right.
As he went by, because she was so amazing, he was
think
moving
it's
so
funny.
fast.
It's a swift jog. So Biden's representing that, he believes he's not too old to be doing this. One of his identities, I suppose, said you have been spending a lot of time with people who would be barrier breaking if they made it to the White House. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, but maybe Harris in particular, talk about their identity at these events, how they calibrate it depending on who the crowd is, and what kind of a connection you can sense when you're there in the room with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when let me start early. When Biden announced and went to South Carolina for the first time, I went there, and it actually dawned on me that it was my first time seeing a man campaign for president in the last
They can do it too.
For
They're
4
allowed, yeah.
for 4 months. Yeah, for 4 months I've been following Warren and Gillibrand and Harris, and I was like, oh look, like dudes running for president. And so I mean, it is different. I mean, the way they use their identity, I think is specific to each candidate. Warren leads with the kind of plan first message, as we all now know, right? Like it is very much trying to orient the crowd around bigger ideals, around progressive structural change, and using her personal story in there, but there's very few references to the fact that if she were to win, it would be barrier breaking. Harris is different. I mean, it is very much, especially recently, been a kind of putting herself out there that she was very resistant to in the earlier portions of their campaign. But what that kind of first debate did, when they had that big response around her using her story to kind of draw a contrast with Joe Biden, there was such a big response there that she's been doing it a little more and more. I saw her in South Carolina. And she is at an NAACP event, so obviously a black audience, and she tells them it matters who is in those rooms, right? It matters who's had experiences in those rooms, and that's obviously is a kind of kinship forward thing. And so I think even when we think back to Barack Obama, he very rarely on that campaign trail said, my identity will be a kind of change aspect for this community. She leans into that. I mean, she announced on Martin Luther King Day with Shirley Chisholm's colors. I mean, Cory Booker, she announced in Black History Month, right? Like Cory Booker did Martin Luther King Day. Like there's a different era right now where both I think black and white Democrats are coming to it, somewhat driven by Trump, with a different racial identity, and they are trying to tap into that in a new way, not just that. That their identity should be used to make connections with black voters, but even in rooms of white voters saying this is a way to come to this campaign and the way to reject ultimately kind of the message that President Trump is espousing.
That's really interesting. I want to bring Katie in on this because, Katie, you just heard a lot of candidates back to back in Nevada and at an event in San Diego. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the San Diego event and how candidates of color and white candidates are sort of speaking more directly to the identity issues that Estelle was talking about.
Sure. So I got back today from an event in San Diego that was a major gathering of a Latino civil rights organization, Unidos US. And at the event, we saw a number of the candidates from Biden to Kamala to Castro, Klobuchar and Bernie were there as well, all speaking in the wake of the shootings, of course, over the weekend. And a number of them, especially Castro, we're speaking in some pretty personal terms, talking about this attack that in El Paso that felt so personal to the Latino community there.
When they're all, sorry, oh, the cards, great. Thank you. When you're hearing everyone back to back, how distinct does the field feel? Do you feel like, wow, there's really a lot of different choices here, or if I close my eyes, I wouldn't quite be sure who's talking?
Well, to take a step back, if you talk to voters about it, there are a lot of voters who are very frustrated with the size of the field. There's this sense that it's just too many people, that it's too hard to start making decisions when you're looking at 24 different candidates, and the feeling that many of them start to blur together. But I will say, seeing a bunch of them speak together one after the other over the weekend at 2 different events, is certainly stylistically there are very sharp differences. Joe Biden has a habit of telling stories. Using kind of his decades in government to illustrate a point that he's trying to make, and that sometimes does result in maybe a tangent, a story from the 70s or 80s, which is and his supporters appreciate that and think that speaks to his experience. It is certainly a very different style from someone like a Kamala Harris who spoke yesterday. She was very fired up. She had a couple new lines on Donald Trump that she was trotting out, and that got a pretty warm response. And so, you can, when you see one after the other, you can really see the kind of sharp stylistic differences. Bernie Sanders is increasingly willing, at least over the last couple of days, to talk about his own family story and their own immigrant story. He's, as of course, since you know him well, not someone who typically—
We've been at parade together, yeah.
Vermont, not someone who talks quite as much about that personal background. It's really interesting to see them.
And you can split if you ask certain questions, right? Like, who do you think Trump is the root of America's problems or is indicative of a structural problem? If you different candidates think that that moderate or is it a question of electability, or a question of big change, right? How much do you mention Trump on the trail? I feel like there's different questions you can ask that cut the field into different pies that aren't necessarily along ideological lines.
It's really interesting. Jonathan, I wanted to ask, we're here, I said we got 455 days to the election.
Who's counting?
We're engaged in our own marathon. In your experience, what should we engaged voters and journalists and consumers of news actually be paying attention to? Like, what is happening right now, very far from November 2020, that is a good, reliable bellwether? I guess I'm asking you, can you predict the future? But really what I mean is, this is not your first presidential election that you're covering. Is there a town that matters most, a poll that matters most, a mood somewhere? What would you say are the bellwethers we actually should be paying attention to, in addition to the very important coverage that you're, of course, all reading all the time?
Sure. Well, that's obviously the first and most important, is make sure that you're reading your daily New York Times and getting all the latest insights from the great lady. But I think beyond that, there are a few indicators that I think are useful. First of all, I strongly prefer Iowa and New Hampshire polls rather than national polls. There is no national primary, if you hadn't realized that yet. This is a sequential process that begins in Iowa and then goes to New Hampshire after that, which probably isn't a news flash for those of you who are in this room tonight. So Iowa and New Hampshire polling is more indicative to me about the state of the race than a national survey. So quality Iowa and New Hampshire polls, typically ones that are done by newspapers or colleges that have a mix of landlines and cell phones, is telling. And looking past the top line question, the horse race question of who's leading, a couple of different things to look for. One of them is favorable and unfavorable. That indicates oftentimes how much a candidate has room to grow. If they are widely liked across the sort of factions of the party, that's a pretty good sign. The other one is who is the second choice of a voter. Who's your backup? because for a lot of these candidates, they're not going to still be on the ballot come February. And so I think that matters too. Who are people willing to go to, and who are they not willing to go to is just as revealing. So I think those two indicators can often be as telling as who is leading at the moment. And then it's just looking at the various demographic groups, and that can sort of tell you what's happening in the race. You know, and it's pretty fixed right now. I've been really struck by just how durable some of these divisions are in the party. Older voters tend to like Joe Biden. Younger voters tend to like Bernie Sanders. College-educated voters and so-called very liberal voters like Warren. And that's been pretty steady so far. And I think the question is kind of when does that really change?
Yeah.
Going back to the start of the year, we've had kind of the rise and then the semi-fall of Mayor Pete, and then Warren's made some gains certainly. But beyond that, my gosh, it's a pretty static race. It hasn't really changed all that dramatically. So,
But
fascinating.
you guys are making it interesting, your coverage. So you mentioned those demographic groups, and I wanted to talk about a slightly different demographic,
Yeah.
which are the way the candidates are engaging online or engaging on social media with voters, or how that they're presenting their brand there. Ested, you're much better at Twitter than I will ever be in my life, which is like not even an appropriate compliment because that's a very low bar. But what is your sense of this moment and how this field is presenting itself digitally, and how engaged voters are, and who's sort of doing the best at positioning themselves as being able to compete with, you know, the president's approach to Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that using the president as a measuring stick is a good point. President Trump is the most internet candidate, and that is not because he is someone who uses it, clearly, but it's someone who, obviously through social media and obviously through the kind of conservative media funnel, a lot of the kind of ideas and ideology we see coming out of the White House, you can track online if you want to. I think on the Democratic side, it's really interesting. If we go back to 2016, right? Like that was the energy from Bernie, a lot of the connection with younger voters. He kind of came, again, like Trump, a figure who does not use the internet, but becomes a figure of the internet, which can, one, really drive fundraising. I think when we think about these candidates across the board, most of them have taken the kind of digital route of fundraising. So how you are and how you are presented online and the splash you make is not just about memes and funniness and young people. It's actually about money, for a lot of these folks. And it's been interesting to see the differences. I would say Warren has had has had an interesting online strategy. They do a lot of background reaching out to online influencers. They do a lot of positioning her to be on the forefront of things that may not be what voters care about in individual states, but will be kind of the talking point of the moment. Me and Jonathan did a story about how she was struggling in fundraising at the beginning of the campaign. When you look back at the ways they kind of changed that, right? It's through the plan saturating, it's through that stuff, but it's also through her coming out first on impeachment, right? It's through her, and those are moral, those are, she would certainly couch those as moral decisions that are clear-eyed, but those are also fundraising boosts. And those were not questions that voters on the trail were asking. Mm-hmm. But that is an understanding of the kind of moment and then trying to lead on that moment. Once we get out of, and she's kind of had a meme-ish quality of Bernie of a couple years ago.
Memes don't raise money. What is the most cringeworthy thing you've seen a candidate do trying to appear hip? Or
well, Buttigieg just got saved, right?
Yeah,
he was about to do an Old Town Road remix with, which, for the record, we had a team predictions that we put in our newsletter, and my prediction was that a candidate will embarrass themselves by doing a viral dance challenge. And I am close. I am so sad that moment did not happen, because I would have been correct in predicting. Well, but I think that those moments are going to come, not just because you want to be the next candidate with thousands of retweets, but because you want to create your kind of moment. But these things come organically, right? Kamala Harris's best online moments have been in judiciary hearings, right? Kind of Pete Buttigieg. The moments that actually break through are oftentimes the natural ones. So I would encourage the candidates to be less thirsty.
I mean, you guys are getting a lot of excellent advice tonight. We got Alexi's advice. I mean, I guess it was to the candidates, but perhaps a universal advice is to be less thirsty.
Yeah, life.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions from me, and then we will turn to your questions here. So one defining thing, one history-making thing here is there are so many people running for president, and you talked a little bit about how voters in the early states are feeling frustrated, but I also imagine logistically it's a little weird, and you guys have all been traveling quite a bit. I wondered if there are any surreal moments where you're, crossing paths with candidates, or just where the size of the field just feels like a particular challenge in how you're actually getting around.
One thing that was notable, it didn't end up happening, I think, for weather reasons, but there was a moment where Kamala's husband and Senator Harris's husband and Pete Buttigieg's husband were both expected to be at a fundraising event, I think, in Florida, and which really speaks to the fact that it's not only candidates who are crossing paths, but there's literally so many of them that sometimes their spouses are crossing paths independent of the candidates, which is just fascinating.
And husbands, two husbands
Yes.
for the first time.
Yeah, en route to Jim Clyburn's fish fry in South Carolina, I had 4 presidential candidates on our flight.
Who had the best seat?
I mean, it was we were going to Columbia, it was a tiny plane, we all were losing. And I was like
The
in line.
democracy was
Yeah,
amazing.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. I was in line at the airport and I looked behind me and there was Marianne Williamson and she was just like chilling.
Levitating.
Yeah.
What's her airport style?
Better than mine. Yeah, I think honestly, it presents a story challenge, if I can be serious. You go to these cattle calls and there's 20 people, and it is impossible to put all those people in a story. If we listed what all 20 people said, that doesn't make for interesting, that doesn't, I think, highlight the things that we need to. And so it creates a kind of, not only a travel challenge, but how do you break through and how do you kind of accurately reflect those moments? I feel like, I have been sitting in the back of a room being like, okay, so 20 people just talked and I have 700 words.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yeah.
It can be awkward. I recall being in Ames, Iowa, pretty early in the year because I had a snowstorm coming back to Des Moines, I remember. And it was for a soup supper where they have various kinds of soup. And it was like a church basement, not terribly big. And there were at least 4 candidates there in pretty tight quarters. And it was awkward because they're all trying to make their way around and kind of do the meet and greet. And some are more popular than others. This is not
everyone gets asked to dance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is not like a kid's soccer game where everybody plays. I mean, there are winners and losers, and you sort of see some of the candidates who draw more attention, and you get kind of the stink eye from the candidates if you're not talking to them or paying attention to them. Heck, when Katie and I were in Des Moines, right after the first debate, July 4th week, we went to this picnic, and there were 3 candidates there, I think, and Senator Harris just had her big breakout moment at the first debate. And so she had a lot of attention, a lot of cameras. And she was doing her post-speech gaggle, which is basically, the gaggle is basically where the candidate will speak to the press for a few minutes and take 3 or 4 questions.
Those are the pictures when it's like one person and then every microphone.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Well, she was doing that, and this is like an outside venue, by the way, so we're all outside, doing that like 100 feet from the actual site of the picnic site, the overhang, where Klobuchar was giving her stump speech. Oof. And so most of the press migrates to the candidate who has this first debate. It's cruel, I mean, and there weren't a lot of folks staying there for the Klobuchar stump speech. Thankfully, thankfully Katie and I were both there. I was thinking Klobuchar. Katie and I were both there, so Katie went to the gaggle, and I made a point of listening to the senator's speech and making sure that she knew I was there listening to her speech. And exactly.
And if she's listening tonight,
respect
Jonathan
must be paid.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So we're going to get to audience questions. One last lightning round here. It's the state fair this week. As a kid, what was your preferred fair ride? And Jonathan, we'll start with.
Oh my gosh. My preferred fair ride. You know, I don't know how many fair rides. I grew up in Virginia, and so I went to King's Dominion a few times, and so I had some pretty intense actual rides. This was like the real thing, you know, like roller coasters.
Okay.
And this is back like, you know, pre-super liability days where it was like, come on in. You know, there was like one bar over your stomach, you know, and you went out on the ride. And,
Okay, we have
you know.
pretty intense.
pretty intense, yeah.
Some before our time, pretty intense
Yeah.
roller coasters.
Yes, totally.
That Jonathan
This is the
Martin to
80s.
tell about,
This
which
is
is
the
great.
80s, you know.
Katie, what was your home state fair, the fair of your childhood? Did you have one?
So I'm from suburban Kansas City, and as I recall, we did not have like a great fair culture, but I did, of course, go to the Iowa State Fair last cycle, and I know there was a lot of discussion of the butter cow earlier
Were
tonight.
you impressed by the butter cow, or were you?
It's like you got to go see it.
Yes,
you know, you got to go see it and
Pay
get what the
respect.
hype is
Right.
about. Exactly. And so I would say that you know, certainly is like sort of my most memorable fair experience, just experiencing the butter cow and watching. I was on the Ted Cruz beat last time and sort of watching him navigate the fair, try and grill pork chops.
That is
Yes.
quite a ride.
Yeah, exactly.
That is- you
In
said you
its
hadn't
own
been a
sense.
ride, but-
Exactly.
Yeah. What was did you have a fair of your
I mean,
childhood?
I'm like from outside Chicago. We weren't really fairing it up, but I did go, did get to Springfield for Illinois State Fair once, where I saw Kelly Clarkson live, which is quite a ride.
Nice. Wonderful. Great. Well, now we're going to hear a couple. You guys had similar themes that people are curious about, and we'll take a couple of these. This one speaks to the size of the field and the mysteries of the human ego. For candidates who have no chance of winning from the beginning, why do you think they run? Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's easy. You want to go ahead?
Yes, Sid, what do you think?
Why not, right? Like if you are someone who has very little to lose, if you're a member of the House right now and you can get on the national debate stage, if things go right, you can get more cable news hits. What's the downside risk, right? Like what are you actually risking and not running is actually the other question.
Yes.
And basically the answer is nothing.
Well, and if you are one of the lower polling candidates, it's unlikely that you are, unless like you have done something truly like crazy in your life, it's unlikely that you're going to get the kind of really intense vetting, intense scrutiny that some of the other candidates, ultimately end up getting, just because they do spend more time in the spotlight. So often there really is very little downside, and you can end up with a TV contributor contract. You can end up as like a prominent, consultant, and take a look at what happened to a lot of the folks who ran last time who did not become president, but for some of those folks ended up in very prominent jobs.
Just think of how many names of people you know now who are running for president who you did not know a year ago. Like if you know the name John Delaney now and you didn't know it a year ago, that is why he's running.
And you might not know something else. Like
Sharks,
that's taking up room in your brain now.
Sharks swim, right? Sharks swim. Politicians seek attention and they run for office. That's the very nature of what they do. I have a rule of thumb that basically, if you weren't already famous, there's usually very little downside to running for president. Now, the downside typically comes if you were already an established figure and you flop. I think those are the candidates that actually have some regrets. If you weren't already pretty well known and you run, it's usually just upside. Like Katie said, there's a lot that you can get out of it. In the history of these campaigns, I mean, they've really become investment opportunities for a lot of politicians, investments in their future prospects to run down the road. Now, every candidate will say, I don't want to be VP, I don't want to run 4 years later. Come on, that's certainly in the back of their mind. But also investment opportunities, like in the literal sense, right? They are making money down the road with books, with paid speaking gigs, with TV contracts, because like Ested said, they've established names for themselves that they never would have gotten before. I mean, it is priceless, the exposure that they're getting now, and especially with these debates, right? These debates have taken on a new life of their own, and they're putting these people, in the living rooms of millions of Americans, right?
Well, fewer millions for the second set than the first set. But yes, so this is a related question on the size of the field. you're saying why you think it's so big. So this question asker wants to know, what is the effect of so many candidates for the Democrats, the Democratic Party?
Yeah.
Would you put it at net negative or net positive? Or you don't have to like do thumbs up, thumbs down, just from the perspective
No
of the
hand-raising
party.
questions at this debate.
Yeah, sorry. From the perspective of the party, having 24 people at this stage, what does that mean for the institution going forward?
Can I dodge it,
Sure.
but kind of give an answer too? I don't think ultimately it means that much.
Yeah.
I think the size of a field the year before November election, I'm just not sure that that has some real impact on the minds of voters when they go to the polls. Look, I think if the race goes for a while because people don't drop out and it becomes this knockdown, drag them out, sort of bloody, combat, and we go to Milwaukee and there's no nominee and there's sort of like blood on the streets, and that wouldn't be a bad story actually. Just thinking out loud here, no, but like if we have a convention that's sort of messy, then maybe we're talking about a different story. But I think right now, yeah, go ahead.
Right. I think the actual 20-something number isn't what matters, but the top 6. Like the number that I think that can end up being the most important is if there is not a coalition being built across the primary, and because of the way the rules are kind of worked and the incentive you have to see it through the convention, if we get to Milwaukee next year again and there is kind of a, I call it the cluster blank scenario, right? Like if that scenario becomes true, then the field really matters because there was no incentive to get out. I don't think by the time, I would be surprised, I should say, if by the time we get to next year's convention, if the bottom 10 candidates ever had any serious effect on the outcome later for Democrats.
And I would add, earlier this year, there was a fear among some Democrats that because the field is so big, there's a scenario where the vote could get so split up that someone who would be a really, in their eyes, unpalatable nominee, someone who, in their eyes, again, could not win the general election, could emerge. But, I don't think that you've heard quite as much of that concern lately, just because we have seen, it's not like every single candidate, all 24 of them are tearing at each other every day, and it does seem like some clear lanes have been established, although certainly you do see some of those clashes among the top 6 or so. So we'll
and think
see.
about how Democrats were saying 2 years ago, the fear is about an untested nominee, right? Like we are coming out of a primary in which, frankly, the nominee, there was frustration because of how anointed said nominee seemed to be. And so, can't have it both ways.
Actually, that's related to another question for people who are covering the race or paying attention in 2016. Have you noticed any changes in the way any candidates who ran in 2016 are running in 2020?
Bernie
so it's
Sanders?
a small
He's
group.
the only one, right?
Yeah.
Who are they talking about?
Well, the president is also running for re-election. Does anything feel particularly different in the way Bernie Sanders is making his pitch?
Look, we've written this a couple of times now. His advisor certainly wanted to talk more about his life story and his biography in a way that he's never been comfortable doing, and that he will do a little bit, and then he'll sort of go back to his old-time religion, which is kind of what Bernie does. So he hasn't appreciably changed. What he has changed, I think, some is there's more retail events now. He kind of had a Trump-like affection for the big rallies and the speeches. He does do more sort of smaller crowds.
And when you say retail, you mean a place where you could shake his hand
Correct.
or perhaps ask for a selfie and be yelled at.
He's
for
doing the
asking.
selfie lines now. They're not technically selfies, but the picture lines
Picture
now
lines,
with people. Katie has kind of a funny experience from that. You get your picture with Bernie, and a lot of people who are running for office, you ask for the picture, and they're politicians. They say, "Oh, I'd love to. Let's get a picture. Come on here." Now Bernie doesn't even fake it like
Yeah,
that.
what happened on the 4th of July? Yeah.
He said, I did 3 parades with Senator Sanders, and
Something in common, Kate.
exactly, and you edited all my parade
Yeah.
content. It was great. What was very striking about his retail campaign style is totally in contrast to most politicians that I've seen who are so eager for the pictures, who will not walk by a baby without stopping and having a whole conversation with the baby. Bernie Sanders was like in a hurry, and every time someone would ask for a picture, he would say, "Okay, very quickly, and take a picture, and go on his way." So
So he's pretty much.
Gotta go.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one
Fine.
question I think we've already got to, but I want to just make sure we covered it all. One of the questions was, what is Marianne Williamson like? Instead you shared some of your experience.
At the airport,
I don't know if there was more about the energy transfer that you wanted to share. But,
I mean, like,
Have you met her?
yeah, have you met her,
I have not met her.
Jonathan?
We had a seance for a while after the Miami debate. I was levitating. No, it was. She was there in Miami, and she was after the debates. The candidates. It used to be the staff, but now it's the candidates come out to the spin room where the press is all.
Actually, could you give people just a
Yeah,
sense
we should
of
give
what
it. Yeah,
that's
this is
like?
good. This
Yeah.
is good inside dope for you guys. So, when we're covering these debates, like, sad to report this, we're not actually in the debate hall. We are not in this room. So, like, we are not in the back of this room covering the debate. We are in a separate holding facility, watching the debate like you are on a TV screen. Except for us, there's like 6 to 7 rows of tables with upholstery, covers, and chairs. And we're sitting there with our laptops, and we're watching the debate on these sort of big screens. Usually next door or like immediately adjacent to that room, there's what's called a spin room, which is where big open space, the staffs of the candidates would come out after the debate and come up to you and basically just BS you. It was a very strong night for Joe Franklin. He was confident the whole night, and we felt very good afterwards. The difference now, the candidates are coming out because they're doing these post-game TV interviews, and so they actually talk to the print reporters too. So now it's more candidate access. So yeah, that's basically how it works.
And
after
she
the
came
debates.
out.
So she came out, right. I'm not sure if it was her or the hologram of her, but she came out. And I didn't want to talk to her very much. But,
Yeah.
can I give the serious Marianne Williamson take?
Please.
Which is that.
Now we're going deep.
Yeah. Which is that, like, in that last debate, I can't, like, there's been so many people, especially coming out of the Trump North Carolina rally, where he is kind of putting forth that like kind of white identity message, who have been, I talk to, like, I write about race all the time and talk to progressive activists who are looking for a candidate who speaks directly to that kind of race forward message that Trump is saying, and have been frustrated with the Democratic field who does it in policy terms, right? Who does it in terms of, here's how I fix the racial wealth gap, here's how I recognize differences between communities, but not the kind of more affirmative message of, like, what is the racial vision for America? And I cannot tell you how my, like, phone was, like, buzzing about, like, why, like, is Marianne Williamson saying the thing I wish X candidate was saying? And so, like, I'm not here to go, stand Marianne in any way. But, I do think that's the weird value of this debate stage, is you have her talking about the kind of bigger vision, the dark psychic force of Trump's candidacy, and then it goes to Elizabeth Warren, who's like, well, here's black home ownership rates. Like, that's a different feeling when it happens side by side than when it happens with just her by herself.
Yeah, it's like a little bit new agey, I think, for a lot of people's taste. But like the actual substance of what she's saying is going somewhere where there's like very few other candidates who are saying it so, emphatically, like she is.
That's wonderful. Great. We have one last question. This is a very sensitive, not new agey, but a nice question from someone in the crowd here. So you're all working very hard, traveling quite a bit. How do you take care of yourself?
Oh, you guys are all soft here. Oh my gosh.
Well, during the relentless news cycles and the toxicity of today's environment.
Oh,
so, yeah, okay. So Katie, do you want to take that one first?
Self-care.
I have a bad and expensive SoulCycle habit, but it is helpful every once in a while.
Jonathan? Also SoulCycle?
Don't get to the SoulCycle very often. That's going to shock this crowd. I know what you're thinking. SoulCycle kind of guy, but no. So when I can, I really enjoy getting out, and especially if I'm in a new city or a city I've only been to once or twice, I love to get out and run to explore kind of the city and see new places and check out where I'm going. And I think that sort of gives you more of a sense of place too. You can sort of see what the community is like. So I enjoy doing that. And then typically afterwards, I will totally nullify the run by eating some really terrible breakfast of some kind to really just make sure that I lost no weight.
You have to get a sense of the place. Yeah, you got to get a sense of the pancakes.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Estelle, what do you want to take care of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing question I'm asking myself. I'd say I love soccer. I watch, and I have become, I feel like as work has gotten more intense, I've like clung to this team in London so deeply, which comes back Saturday, so you should watch Tottenham versus Aston Villa on Saturday. But
Whoa,
oh, wow.
Tottenham crowd.
All right. There we go, Coys, everyone. But I feel like kind of clinging to whatever the fun aspect is, and I had a week off in February, and I was literally sitting on the couch on the Thursday like, what am I gonna do? And then I was like, I'm gonna go watch soccer in Europe. And I literally 2 days later went to England and Spain and watched the Champions League and came back so feeling great. And I'm gonna do that like every possible time.
Good for you.
I'm gonna deplete my
Do it.
life.
Wonderful. Well, I want to, the notion of clinging to fun is a good one because that's what we're hoping to do here. This is our first Politics Live event, but it's something we're hoping to do monthly to bring you sort of the voices that you read, the people who you might see on TV, so you can see them live, and that we can bring you, all of the fun and the serious conversation that is going into how we're thinking about this campaign.
I just want to say one thing. We love reader emails and notes, especially if they're mildly polite.
Mildly polite.
If you want to contact us, we'd love to hear from you. If you have story ideas, if you have suggestions, if you have some very constructive critiques, please email us. I'm jonathan.martin@nytimes.com.
Oh, boy.
You can
I was like, if the bar is giving your email address on stage, I already said earlier how terrible I am at email, but you should email these people and they'll get back to you. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming here for the inaugural version of the show. I hope you'll stay in touch and come back and continue reading and being engaged with the story and engaged with the Times. And it's just a real pleasure to have you here tonight. So please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you.
So, sorry, I just want to give everyone, so we had Melissa Clark and Jonathan earlier. We had Lindsay Krause and Lexi Pappas, and on stage right now, we had Jonathan Martin, Katie Gluck, and Estelle Herndon. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.